Hello everyone and welcome to Capitol Watch for Friday, January 17th, our weekly look at the Missouri Legislature. And joining me is MSBA's Governmental Relations Consultant, Mike Grote. And Mike, thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you.
And this past week, Mike, things really got underway in the legislature, didn't they? Hearings began to happen.
They did. So this is the second legislature or second session of this legislature. And so they're up and running. The committees are there, and we are having committee hearings every single day this past week. So things are in full swing.
Mm-hmm. One of those hearings, Mike, had to do with the House Budget Committee, and actually the Commissioner of Education testified at that particular hearing regarding the impact of the student transfer law. Tell us about that.
Sure. So this is the time of year where all the different departments come in, just provide generic information essentially at this point to both the Budget Committee on the House end of the building and the Appropriations Committee on the Senate end, and just get them familiar with what the budget looks like and what some of their needs are. And so the Department of Education, of course, was in front of the budget hearing and essentially talking about transfer and the increased funds that they're going to need and the potential for bankruptcy for one district immediately and two more in the immediate future.
Mm-hmm. So the commissioner was asking the budget committee for some additional funds for those districts?
She was clearly stating that without additional funding that Normandy would potentially go bankrupt this year, and Riverview Gardens and Kansas City in the following year. Mm-hmm. So although the request wasn't there for a dollar amount, she was definitely arguing that funds were necessary to help with the transfer issue.
Mm-hmm. Another issue that came up this week, Mike, was tax cuts in a Senate committee, and there was a hearing on several bills related to tax cuts.
Sure. So last week we discussed that this committee was going to take place, and there's 3 bills out there right now, 2 by Senator Schmidt, 1 by Senator Kraus. Senator Kraus was the sponsor of kind of the comprehensive language last year. All 3 of them either tweak personal income, corporate income, in some way, shape, or form, and Senator Schmidt's is probably the more complicated of the 3 bills. It's got a 5-year phase-in, and it's got a formula that is net GR from this year minus the last 3 years divided by 100 million times a percentage, and so you get lost in that to some extent. I think Senator Kraus has a much more simple version, and he's just trying to reduce both the top rates as well as personal income tax and try to come up with a solution that he thinks will be beneficial for a number of Missourians.
And among those who had some comments on the tax cut bills during that hearing was Senator Paul LaVota of Independence. And let's take a look at Senator LaVota's comments now.
The purpose of the whole exercise last year was that it would hurt revenue, and there was no proof that cutting taxes would grow, because I don't think there's we're in a low tax state. We believe, as a kind of a Missouri common sense, that we should have low taxes. We all want lower taxes, but we also want good schools, and we also want roads. And I'm using this, I'm sorry if I'm using this as the opportunity, but the point of and I don't want to speak for the governor, but the point of the veto was not, hey, we shouldn't have less taxes. The point was we shouldn't demolish our revenues to hurt our other responsibilities. And so far, no one in favor of this stuff has talked about that.
All right, Mike, and Senator LaVota there commenting on his concerns about the possible loss of state revenue as a result of tax cut bills, and that's a concern that we would share, isn't it?
It's definitely the concern that we had last year and that followed throughout the interim and to now. And it's definitely a concern that we share, and we're trying to figure out how to craft a path that doesn't hurt public education in the state and ensures that we're going to continue to have the revenue to educate the children in the state.
Mm-hmm. That the broader issue of tax cuts, though, Mike, it does have momentum in the legislature, doesn't it? And isn't the goal of some of the legislative leaders to pass some sort of tax cut bill rather quickly?
This issue isn't going away, and they were very successful with it last year. It is coming back. They will pass something this year. It will be scaled down, I think, from what we saw last session, and try to answer all the arguments that were made against last year's bill. So it's definitely going to be a very hard fight on that issue this year for public education.
And obviously we'll be keeping an eye on that and trying to analyze whatever proposals emerge and what their possible impact on state revenue would be.
Yes.
Right. All right, Mike, another issue that came up this week had to do with ethics and campaign finance reform. the Secretary of State and a legislator in the House had a particular bill that they were proposing, but there are other ethics and campaign finance reform bills out there. That seems to be an issue that's getting a lot of attention this year.
This is the issue du jour, it seems like. There's a little over 20 some odd bills that have been filed both in the House and in the Senate dealing with campaign finance reform, ethics reform, lobbyist reform in some way, shape, or form. And it's everything from restriction on contribution amount to making sure there's not a revolving door where legislators can immediately become lobbyists, and eliminating the donations, or gifts, I guess, that legislators are receiving. Missouri is one of the last states, one of 4 states left in the entire country that allows unlimited contributions, unlimited gifts, as well as corporate and labor gifts to legislators. So we're still the wild, wild west in that arena.
And of course, Mike, looking to next week, the big event of the week will be the Governor's State of the State address on Tuesday night. And tell us about that and why all that is important.
Sure. So that's kind of almost the kickoff to session. Once the governor provides his State of the State, that's when he announces what his budget will be, and that's the start of that process. And the budget, occupies so much of the legislative year and so much of everyone's energy, as that's the only constitutional duty that the legislature has, is to pass a budget. And so that evening he will announce his legislative priorities. There'll be headlines, topics, not necessarily specific legislation, but then he'll also release his budget book, which has his plans for the fiscal state of Missouri.
And of course, we'll be paying a lot of attention to what he recommends, for example, on the foundation formula.
There's hope that there's increased funding there. We're looking at Missouri's revenues are ticking upwards right now, and so there's a little bit of extra play money in the budget, something that we haven't seen in nearly 6 years here in this state. So this will be one of the first years we don't see appropriators looking for ways to cut, and so hopefully public education will be a beneficiary of that.
And of course, there'll be other legislative hearings related to education coming up next week, won't there?
Correct. So next week, we'll have both the House and the Senate education committees have hearings planned and scheduled, as well as joint education will be meeting again next week. So.
All right, Mike Grote, thanks a lot for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And we thank you for being with us on this edition of Capitol Watch. And as always, we'll be keeping you up to date on legislative issues through our weekly Legislative Voice email newsletter, our daily blog on the front page of the MSBA website, and of course this program, which we record and post on our website every Friday during the legislative session. Thanks again for being with us on this edition of MSBA's Capitol Watch.